Welcome to State of Play. I'm Will Todman, Chief of Staff of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this podcast, we bring together our leading experts to unpack the latest geopolitical developments from around the world and what it all means. So in a speech at his inauguration, President Trump said, "Our power will stop all wars and bring a new spirit of unity." Then when he was in Saudi Arabia last month, he repeated this, and he said, "My greatest hope is to be a peacemaker and a unifier. I don't like war." 1 month later, the US conducted historic strikes against various sites in Iran before announcing a ceasefire between Israel and Iran a few days later. And we're recording this at noon on the 24th, Tuesday, the 24th of June. And I probably need to say that because things can continue to evolve quite quickly. But, meanwhile, the war in Gaza continues unabated. And Putin said last week, all of Ukraine is ours. And he floated the idea of invading the city of Sumy in northeastern Ukraine. So how should we understand the Trump administration's diplomatic strategy? And what do its results in the first 5 months tell us about how the world order is changing? We are delighted to have Max Bergmann back. Thank you.
Great to be back.
So we're having you here to talk about the Europe and the Russia angle. Have you accrued any more points, air miles, since we last spoke?
I have not.
Okay, good.
I've been quite local, just suffering through the heat here in Washington.
Oh, yes.
As we bake on a 100-degree day here.
It is horrendous for those of you not in DC. But we're also really delighted to be joined by Mona Yacoubian, the new Middle East Program Director as Senior Advisor. And just a few weeks after starting at CSIS, a war has broken out in the region.
I promised excitement.
Yeah, well,
I brought it with me.
When I started at CSIS, there was Russia and had just invaded Ukraine. So welcome, Mona.
The dynamic duo.
Well, we're very grateful, Mona, that you would take the time to join us. And there's a reason to be especially grateful to you. Today is your birthday. And rather than having a nice birthday lunch, you have chosen to talk about war with me and Max. So,
As a true foreign policy nerd, I can't think of a better way to celebrate than this.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We're very grateful to have you. So maybe, Mona, if we can start with you. President Trump's statements and strategy on Iran seem to have shifted a lot over the last 5 months, and even a lot over the past 2 weeks, over the last week has shifted a lot. Can you help us understand kind of what's going on there? Like, how is this strategy shifting?
I mean, I think a dizzying set of turns and U-turns. But I think if we could try to find a through line, Will, in all of this, I do think President Trump remains in pursuit of the deal. And so, yes, he absolutely made the decision, a very consequential one, to undertake military strikes against Iran. But it's also clear, I think, in the last 24 hours, his signaling that he has now negotiated this ceasefire, called for it, and is bent on ensuring that it remains so. So I think this suggests that he's looking for a path toward the negotiating table.
But can you help us understand? So he was in talks. The US was undertaking talks with Iran. We'd had 5 rounds so far, both in Oman and in Italy. Why does his calculation change? Why did he essentially give the green light to Israel to attack Iran, and then ultimately he then decided to join in with the US as well?
Well, the sequence on that is a little bit under question as to whether he greenlit Israel or whether Israel sort of found and took this opening. There's lots of interesting reporting on this. Opted to undertake these strikes. And then when President Trump saw that the strikes were successful and Israel was gaining momentum in the battle space, then associated the U.S. with it. And then I think there were some interesting behind-the-scenes discussions with Prime Minister Netanyahu, convinced Trump to undertake the strikes. And there you have it.
I totally agree. I don't think that the Trump administration or the president came in to office saying, what I'm going to try to do in my first 6 months is bomb Iran and potentially have another war that the U.S. is engaging in the Middle East. I don't think that was a priority. I think this was a clear opening by the Israelis to try to push the administration to do what it's wanted each of the previous administrations to do, which is to take military action against Iran. And, to give the Israelis credit, they had sort of set the table by dealing with Hezbollah, Hamas, and the fall of Assad in Syria, where it seemed sort of less costly for the US to take action. But I think this was a case where the president got jammed, was stuck in a very difficult situation once Israel decided that it was going to launch, and made the call that actually the Iranian retaliation might be very limited. And thus far, it looks like that may be the case. But I think we're, this isn't sort of the beginning of this process.
And one of the differences between how President Trump approached Iran and then how previous presidents, especially President Obama, did, was it seems that it was a bilateral negotiation, really. There were no other international actors engaged in these negotiations, at least not yet. Whereas for the JCPOA, there were Europeans were there, Russia and China were involved, to a degree. What should we how important is that this was just a US-Iran negotiation?
I mean, I think he did bring the Gulf on board, and I think that was a notable difference between what Trump bringing the Gulf on board as opposed to Obama, where the Gulf felt blindsided. And so, in a funny way, you almost had, and I'd be curious, Max, what you think. You almost had the opposite. During the JCPOA, Europe was deeply engaged, as was Russia, and the Arabs were kind of kept out. This time, there was at least discussions. The Omanis, of course, played this important mediating role, but the Europeans felt sidelined. And so it's kind of an interesting difference between the two, and kind of where it goes from here, I don't know. But that's certainly something I heard in the region, was concern that the Europeans being sidelined may also kind of be hardliners in this.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the JCPOA in some ways was a classic arms control deal. And, the Europeans are frequently complaining when the US negotiates with Russia in arms control agreements, sort of over their heads. But in the Iran case, the Europeans were involved. It was the P5, a very sort of traditional arms control agreement. And I think what you had is a sense, Gulf states feeling quite strong, feeling, as well as the Israelis, that the Iranians weren't going to agree to anything, that Iran was sort of on the up, that Iran would cheat. Not having a lot of experience actually with these sorts of arms control agreements, something that the US, Russia, and Europeans had quite a lot of experience. I think right now the Europeans feel very helpless. Look, I mean, my view is the Middle East in some ways is a hard power region. Europeans don't have a lot of hard power, at least collectively, that they can assert in the region. And there's a degree of whiplash because the Europeans were just about and had started to take action against the Israelis and sanctioning some Israeli officials over Gaza. And you had this kind of split emerging between the EU and Israel, and then Israel took this action, and actually you've seen the Europeans sort of soften their line against Israel because in some respects, the French and others have had a harder line on Iran than we have at times.
But they did try, right? So last week, the E3 met with the Iranian foreign minister, I believe, in Geneva. And there's a piece of me, and I say this as a European, despite Brexit, I am still a European. But why even bother? Like, what were they hoping to achieve?
Well, I think what they were hoping is to build up a diplomatic process and to try to demonstrate sign of action and that there's a path there. So I think that was the major effort, that they are willing to sit down with the Iranians, the Americans maybe not quite as willing. So hence they can have a conversation, report back, also demonstrate relevance. Europeans are trying to figure out how to be relevant in the world when European member states, the UK's, the France, are no longer as powerful as they used to be. And yet Europe still struggles collectively to act as one on foreign policy. So you kind of have this hybrid effort. And also there's a clear recognition that, look, the Middle East really matters for European security. It's the source of migration flows. Instability in that region matters probably much more to Europe now than it does to the United States. Also oil flows, other things like that. So, I think there is a European, quote unquote, national security interest in the Middle East. They just really struggle to figure out how to assert themselves on the region, to shape the region in the direction that they want it to go.
Does that mirror at all how Gulf states are feeling about this? I mean, you said that they were much more involved, Mona, but do they feel that they can shape the direction that this took between the US and Iran, or are they kind of bystanders as well?
I think they are feeling incredibly blindsided, swept into some direction, out of control in terms of what has just transpired in the region. I mean, in a lot of ways, what we've seen is really the beginnings of what would be a nightmare scenario for the Gulf. And so I think that, at the time of President Trump's trip to the region last month, which actually feels like decades ago, I think the Gulf was kind of riding high. Like, hey, they've got this guy, and he came to the Gulf. He didn't go to Israel. All kinds of deals. I think they understood and thought they could speak to Trump in his language and that things were moving in their direction. And then everything kind of literally blew up. And so now I think they find themselves really trying to gain their footing, trying to understand where all things are headed. I think they will cling tenaciously to this role of mediating, quietly behind the scenes, overtly if needed. They're not going to be bystanders because I think the stakes here for them are existential. But what can they do? How much leverage do they have? Those are all very much open questions.
How about Russia? So Russia signed a defense pact with Iran earlier this year. Doesn't seem to me that this has resulted in much defense collaboration, given that, as far as I have seen, Russia did nothing to help Iran during all of this.
In that defense pact, there was no mutual defense agreement, so Russia didn't
Mhm.
pledge to come to Iran's defense if it were in danger, and Iran didn't pledge to do the same. This has been kind of a transactional relationship over time, and the major problem for Iran, I think what we're seeing, is that they didn't have the air defense, the military capacity to really in depth to really trouble the Israelis. So you could argue that what Iran really needs right now are Russian fighter jets, Russian air defense, Russian missiles. Oh, but there's a problem. Number one, Russia, I'm not sure, is totally sure that it wants to provide Iran with all that offensive weaponry to go strike the Israelis, of which the Russians also actually have a fairly, I don't want to say close relationship, but the Israelis have not been forward leaning on Ukraine in part because of the relationship they've had with Russia and Russia's position in Syria. So does Russia want to provide any offensive weaponry? Well, it also doesn't really have it because it's using it in Ukraine, and the same is true with air defense. And then with aircraft, perhaps there's something there, but that takes time. So I think what you see is essentially a transactional relationship in which the Iranians have provided support to the Russians, but the Russians aren't really in position to support Iran in the way that Iran would want. And when we think about drones, well, the Iranians basically provided Russia with the capacity to build Iranian drones in Russia. So Russia doesn't really need Iranian drones. It's building Iranian drones. So maybe it could provide some of that to Iran. But so I think where we are is the Russians weren't really to put a lot of skin in the game, at least militarily in terms of providing support, or to put their forces potentially in between the Israelis and the Iranians was not something they're willing to do. They're fighting a war where they've lost a million men and they're launching a major offensive against the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians just destroyed a lot of their bomber fleet. So Russia really staying on the sidelines here, and it's not really an alliance. I think that's pretty clear.
Aragchi definitely must have come to that conclusion during his trip to Moscow, where really there was only, happy talk coming out of it, but nothing concrete. And it does seem as though Russian equities do not in any way, shape, or form going to drive them toward providing anything concrete to Iran at this time. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think if perhaps there was no war in Ukraine, the Russians might have operated a bit differently. But there is a war in Ukraine, and so they're just that is their major focus. But I want to ask you on the Gulf states. I mean, it does strike me that suddenly Iran looks incredibly weak, incredibly exposed militarily. They have doesn't appear to have much air defense. Their missile barrages, have been sort of symbolic. They have cost lives, so we should acknowledge that, especially in Israel, but not the devastation that one might have expected. Is there any part of some of the Gulf states that are saying, maybe we could take advantage of this and shift the balance in the Gulf?
I don't know about take advantage. Certainly not militarily. I mean, I think that the Gulf probably on a level is breathing a sigh of relief about the ways in which Iran actually has been really cut down to size. But I guess I would raise two cautionary notes that I think probably is running through the minds of Gulf strategists and others. I mean, one is a badly weakened Iran is potentially a very dangerous Iran. And kind of what Iran chooses to do and how it chooses to assert itself in this, badly damaged position is a question. And really, it's about this idea of potentially a rush to a nuclear device, however crude, in order to reassert deterrence in some way. The second is that there's a very weak Iran and there's an increasingly strong Israel. And I think there are probably some questions for the Gulf about what does that mean? What does it mean for Israel to be asserting that kind of power in the region when for the Gulf in particular, the key objective has been and continues to be de-escalate conflict, right? Be able to focus on diversifying their economies and build out ties, across the region, help stabilize Syria, kind of bring the region into another era. Now I think big question marks about where all of this is headed.
And I want to bring this back to the Trump administration's strategy as well and think through how are other international actors seeing what has just happened in Iran or between Iran and Israel over the past few weeks? What lessons are they taking from this? Is the lesson that to protect yourself against a regional hegemon like Israel is becoming, you have to have a nuclear deterrent, or is that a too extreme lesson to be drawing from this?
I mean, I don't know what you think, Max, but I do think we have to ask questions, and perhaps historians will, about what these past 12 days have meant for whatever remains of the rules-based order, and we could probably debate that too, and kind of what precedents have been set with respect to concerns about uh, potentially imminent nuclear weapons capability and how to manage. And I do think, especially sort of, I think, and I'm curious your thoughts, Europeans in particular, look on this perhaps with more than a little alarm about what it means for these traditional institutions of global governance that appear utterly impotent and unable to do anything to address this kind of a threat, but rather we see it being addressed through kinetic means and in ways that really are highly unpredictable and very dangerous.
Yeah, we sort of forget that the Iraq War was launched under the pretense of that the Iraqis were in violation of UN resolutions of the United Nations, of international law, because of their weapons of mass destruction program, which it turned out not to really exist. But they were in violation, and so the Bush administration, when Colin Powell went to the UN in early 2003, that he was making the case, and it turned out, and there was a whole effort to get the UN Security Council to say they're in violation. In Iran has been in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. You could go through a similar process, but no one is even raising that. I had a piece in Foreign Policy about how America kind of blew its unipolar moment, and one of the examples of that is the rules-based international order that we helped build and create, after World War II with creating the UN. We just don't really talk about the United Nations and international law and international rules that much anymore. And, I think this strike can be justified in all sorts of ways. There is a cost when you take unilateral action to supposedly enforce an international norm and rule, but you don't really try to lay the groundwork for that. And I think that that is a broader problem. And I think the way the Europeans see it is that the international rules-based system is in some ways dissolving and collapsing. Maybe just one quick point on the Trump administration. I think Trump is desperate to not actually have a war. He's hoping that this is like the strike that he did in his first term on Soleimani, where you do a strike, the Iranians do a performative response, and then everyone moves on with themselves with their lives. I don't know if that is can actually be the case here, but I think that is clearly where the Trump administration is going, and so I don't think that's necessarily a coherent strategy, but I think it is in line with the tactics of this administration, and I think that does put some, China and others on edge. You don't quite know how, this administration is going to react. There's a degree of unpredictability. Perhaps there's some advantages to that. And you could argue that, the Russians didn't want to take action against Ukraine because they weren't totally sure what Trump or the United States would do. under Biden, it was pretty clear you're going to have a more measured response. It's going to, in some ways, be more legalistic and thought through, in some ways more predictable. And there's certain benefits to that. I think in general, there's some costs, and that may mean that countries can take actions based on your predictability.
And I think one thing on the ceasefire is that we have seen some Israel come to ceasefires elsewhere in the region, in Lebanon, but continue to strike now and again. So there might be a difference between a real and lasting ceasefire versus a ceasefire setup that allows Israel to continue to strike at the time of its choosing if it sees a threat reach a certain threshold. And presumably that's also really concerning to other states in the region who are very worried about the power and the influence that Israel's now exerting.
Look, I think if we look even a year ago almost, the first time there was direct military confrontation between Israel and Iran, that was sort of, there had been the shadow war for years. But we saw twice last year, in April and again in October, this direct military confrontation between these two powers. And, a Rubicon truly had been crossed. And I'm not sure in hindsight if we all appreciate just how momentous that was. Because I think, in a way, what we're watching is the logical extension of that. It's a little bit of a boiling frog kind of thing where it became sort of a little bit normalized. And now I think for the region, back to rules, I mean, again, speaking to those in the Gulf, in particular, Gulf Arabs, they're sort of terrified. Like, we're in a region with no guardrails, no rules, no order, and we don't know where this is going. And I do think the world needs to pay attention to the Middle East right now, because is this a harbinger of, I mean, not to sound overly gloomy, especially on my birthday, but is this a harbinger of, broader disorder? What are the lessons that are being taken here that have implications all over the place? Taiwan, we see it in Ukraine, potentially elsewhere.
The Obama administration's strategy was clearly a degree of kicking the can down the road. And there's something to be said about kicking the can down the road. And you could argue that that was the right strategy. And you look at Iran's enrichment, and it had gone down after the JCPOA. I think it was working. It was kicking the can. And basically, the hope was at some point maybe this regime would collapse and you wouldn't have to deal with this problem. The Israelis never liked that strategy. They wanted the confrontation. The Trump administration has now done it. They've given it to them. They've struck. And I think there's a few questions that come out of this. I think from the global standpoint of what lessons do countries take, I think there's a few. Like, one might be, if you don't fiddle around, if you're going to go a nuclear direction, go as fast as possible and just do it. Because the moment that you are sort of on the cusp and trying to negotiate, you never know if the Americans are going to hit you in the face anyway, or the hammer is going to come down on you. So act very quickly. But I think there's also a deterrent to just going the nuclear path as well, that you could end up like North Korea, which, okay, you could have a nuclear weapon, but totally isolated, or attacked like Iran. I do think the question going forward, and I'm curious for Mona's thoughts on this, is that, look, I feel like we're now going to be in a constant fog of anxiety, where the Israelis are now going to be super paranoid about what they don't know. How much did the Iranians get out of their nuclear sites? How
The
quickly
enriched uranium.
the enriched
Yeah,
uranium?
yeah.
Do they have secret facilities that maybe even Israeli intelligence doesn't know about?
Well, they've alluded to it. They've actually stated that there's another facility out there, the Iranians.
Does Iran have a secret stash of more advanced missiles, or missiles that then could, you could put a nuclear device on that could strike Israel? I think what we're getting into is this fog of uncertainty where the Israelis will be constantly on edge and, wanting to strike more, hit more, because if you're Iran, why don't you race to go get a nuclear site? And I think if you're the Trump administration, you want this to be over. So I think I think there's a lot of tension going forward. Maybe not in the next few weeks, but I could see 3 months from now, the Israelis like, we have to go again. We have to go again. And the Trump administration says no. And so I don't quite see how this ends in a place where the Israelis are confident and assured of their security, short of the regime change phrase that the Trump administration doesn't want to get near, but the Israelis are going all in on.
And it does, I mean, that is, I think, the concern that this does slide toward this conflict gets resurrected in some way, shape, or form. And especially if there's some effort by Iran, or there's a concern that this is what they're going to do is make that race to a crude device, that it does slide toward regime. I've heard today was told regime degradation, okay, because regime change, it's not clear what would replace the Ayatollahs. And I do think, to me, that's a recipe, unfortunately, for the region for disaster, because the region really is at a moment, having had already more than 2 decades of conflict, where it's imperative that they find a way to stabilize. And this is what was driving the Gulf. This is what drove their decision, frankly, that, okay, we got to live with Iran, because they understood that from an economic perspective, they simply cannot tolerate yet another war and years of conflict. And so I think you've painted the picture exactly right, Max. And I think it begs the question of, okay, what or who or how to somehow shift the region out of this dynamic, because the dynamic feels quite self-perpetuating in the way that you're framing it, and I think that is correct. And I don't know what the answer is, and I do think the Trump administration is not interested in the kind of deep and long-term diplomatic muscle that it will take in order to help the region sort of right itself.
Pivoting to Asia.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay, well, you have both painted quite a gloomy picture, even though we had this ceasefire announcement yesterday or on Monday. We There's a huge amount of anxiety going forward for Israel, for Iran, for Arab Gulf states, for U.S. allies and partners around the world, and even some, I think, for U.S. adversaries as well, for Russia and China, not knowing quite how to understand this. But I think you've helpfully laid out that precedents have been shattered over the past 12 days. This Rubicon has been crossed. This is perhaps a further step towards the breakdown of this rules-based order, and everything is going to be less predictable. Maybe there's some power in that, and President Trump certainly sees the power in that, but there are also very real risks in it. So thank you so much for helping us zoom out from this moment and think bigger picture. I do want to end with the 3 quickfire questions that we will be doing each time. So the first one, Mona, if I can start with you. So if you can sum up developments in Iran in one word, what would that be?
I think it's one word: roller coaster.
And Max, in Iran, or actually, we've not even talked about NATO. Okay, sorry, no time for that now, probably, but
I think I said it. I think I would say fog. We don't quite know where this is going, where this is headed, and I think there's a lot of confusion.
So the next one then, in terms of the sort of balance of power and who's up and who's down. So between the US, Russia, and China, who has had the best week? Who is up the most? Who's down the most? Max, starting with you.
I think the US has had a good week. We'll see if it lasts, but it did this successful strike. It demonstrated its power. But I think China has also probably had a good week because the US is now, potentially really engaged in the Middle East when we were trying to pivot to Asia.
Mona?
I mean, I think I would agree with part of that. I do think the U.S. has had a good week. I think the U.S. has demonstrated, we'll have to see where it goes, but at this moment of crisis, its indispensability, its ability to step in and do something pretty significant. By contrast, at least in the Middle East, that's my narrow perspective, I think we see the relative impotence of Russia and China to shape those kinds of developments. And so I think this has sort of been an interesting case study that we can explore further about what kind of role do these strategic rivals play in a place as foggy and roller coastery as the Middle East.
Well, I'm very pleased you said that, Mona, because on Monday we will be doing an event that will bring together experts on Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran to discuss what this all means for this so-called Crink Alliance. So people should check that out on Monday the 30th. But a final question, if you could wave your magic wand, what one word or phrase would you ban pundits from saying when they're talking about all of this?
Crink. No, I'm
Oh,
kidding.
great. You're not allowed to say that because we're doing work on it.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I mean, I'm going to go after myself, okay? Because I have talked a lot about this being a decisive moment in the Middle East. And I do think analysts, we do search for kind of, is this fulcrum, et cetera. And I think it's a little less definitive than that.
Max.
I'm going to go slightly off topic, and it's sort of two words, not one, now that I think about it, but 5%. The NATO summit is happening this week.
Yes.
European countries, in an effort to appease Trump and hopefully in their hopes of keeping the Americans in, are going to pledge to spend 5%. It used to be 2% on defense. Now it'll somehow magically be 5%, and they have no real intention, most of them, getting to that number. And I think we're going to hear a lot about European defense spending targets, which is frankly a real distraction from what they need to do, which is to cooperate more and not just spend separately. But 5% is the words that I would wish I didn't have to hear.
Okay, you've heard it here. Please don't keep saying 5% or you'll upset Max. Thank you so much, Mona and Max, for joining. Really appreciate your time.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Happy birthday.
Great way to celebrate.
Thanks for listening to State of Play. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to it wherever you heard it. And you can find more analysis at www.csis.org/geopolitics. Until next time.